The first decision had already been made. The city of Mytilene was to be destroyed, every man executed, every woman and child enslaved. A trireme, swift and silent, had been dispatched with the sentence. The judgment of Athens was in motion, irreversible, it seemed. There was no fanfare, no debate lingered in the air. The people, stirred by the scent of treason, nodded grimly. Mytilene had rebelled, and in wartime rebellion was not a crime, it was a contagion, one that had to be cut off without mercy. But then something shifted. A second assembly was called, not out of compassion, not even out of doubt, but out of discomfort. A haunting silence had followed the decision, the kind that does not scream, but scratches, that second guess that comes not from the heart, but from the gut. Could this be a mistake? It was too late, wasn't it? The ship had already left, the judgment had already been spoken. What remained then was not a question of guilt or innocence, but of time. Thus began one of the most fateful debates in Athenian history, a debate not just about Mytilene, but about the soul of Athens itself. Would it be ruled by anger or by counsel? Would it act from fear or from reason? Would it have the courage to pause? And could a second ship, launched with nothing but words and hesitation, truly overtake the wrath already set in motion? This is not just a political story. It is a human one, a near tragedy. A moment when justice held its breath and waited, not for heroes, but for wisdom to arrive in time. To understand why Athens nearly chose annihilation, we must step into its state of mind. The Peloponnesian War was no longer a war of ideals. It was a war of attrition. Allies were wavering, enemies encroaching. And in a world where cities defected as easily as they pledged loyalty, paranoia became policy. Mytilene was not a minor outpost. It was a prominent city on the island of Lesbos, a member of the Athenian alliance, and once considered trustworthy. Its revolt was a slap in the face, not just diplomatically, but emotionally. The Athenians had invested in an empire of words and gold. Mytilene responded with defiance, and Athens, wounded, did what all great powers in decline tend to do. It reacted from fear disguised as strength. The revolt was contained. Mytilene had surrendered. The crisis was over. But rage, once awakened, does not retire quietly. The first vote, the vote for death, was not about strategy. It was about sending a message. A display of resolve, a warning to others. The kind of decision made not around maps and plans, but over clenched jaws and sleepless nights. And so Athens stood at the edge of becoming the very tyrant it claimed to fight. This was the true battlefield, not Mytilene, but the assembly floor. Not fought with weapons, but with rhetoric. Not over land, but over identity. Would Athens define itself by principle or by fear of losing control? The first voice to rise in that hall was not calling for mercy. It called for certainty, for punishment, for the illusion of invincibility. It was the voice of Cleon, and it would not be the last. Cleon did not enter the assembly with trembling hands or tempered tones. He entered like a man certain of the world, and certain of what kept it in order: fear. His argument was not chaotic, it was coherent, and that was what made it dangerous. He did not call for vengeance in the name of the gods or in a fit of fury. He called for it in the name of deterrence. His reasoning was chilling in its clarity. If rebellion goes unpunished, others will follow. If Athens shows softness, the empire will unravel. Mercy is not noble, it is naive. Justice, he said, should be swift and absolute, or it is not justice at all. Cleon framed leniency as betrayal, not of Athens' might, but of Athens' future. To spare Mytilene would be to send a signal that revolt is survivable, that disloyalty might be negotiated. And in a time of war, such a message, he warned, was a death sentence to the empire. In Cleon's vision, the empire was not held together by loyalty, but by fear of consequence. The edge must be sharp, the hand must not tremble. The sword, once raised, must fall. Many in the assembly nodded, not because they were cruel, but because they were afraid. Cleon's voice gave their anxiety structure. His speech gave their dread permission. And in that moment, anger wore the mask of logic. This is the trap of fear. It often sounds like wisdom, but even as the chamber swayed toward Cleon's certainty, another voice waited, quieter, slower, and far less comforting. Not because it promised safety, but because it reminded them of something harder than punishment: consequence. When Diodotus stood to speak, the room did not still out of reverence. It stilled out of tension. This was not a man of charisma or clamor. He did not thunder. He reasoned. And that in a room inflamed by fear was the boldest act of all. Diodotus did not speak of mercy. He did not plead for compassion. Instead, he made a subtler, more difficult case, that even punishment must be intelligent, that justice, when ruled by impulse, becomes indistinguishable from panic. He did not deny that Mytilene had erred. He did not excuse rebellion. But he asked, what comes after vengeance? If all the guilty are dead, who remains to fear punishment? If the people are slaughtered alongside the leaders, what ally will ever trust Athens again? He spoke not of emotion, but of outcomes, not of morality, but of math. Diodotus's argument was that execution is irreversible, but rebellion is not. That killing everyone eliminates not only the threat, but also the usefulness of reintegration. That harshness without strategy is not strength, it is waste. Most strikingly, he did not say Cleon was wrong. He said Cleon was short-sighted. And then came the quiet dagger of his address. Haste and anger are the two greatest obstacles to wise counsel. With that, the room was reminded. Decisions made in rage rarely survive in history as reason. Diodotus did not offer certainty. He offered a delay, a second thought, a ship that might catch the first, not because it was faster, but because it carried something heavier than fear: responsibility. The assembly did not erupt. It wavered. What followed Diodotus's speech was not a roar of approval, but a flicker of reconsideration. For a moment, the fire of fury met the weight of doubt. The pause he had asked for, he received. The second vote was not a triumph. It was a near miss, a razor's edge. The final tally was agonizingly close, but it tipped toward restraint, toward caution, toward something Athens had nearly abandoned: deliberation. Another ship was ordered, swift rowers, minimal weight, urgency without panic. They were racing not just against the sea, but against time, and against the consequences of their own earlier haste. The first ship carried a sentence. The second ship carried a second chance. Some say the winds were favorable. Others say the crew did not sleep. History does not record their names, but it remembers their arrival. Just in time, the order to execute was revoked. Mytilene was spared. The sword raised was not dropped. It was caught mid-air. Athens had acted in rage. Then it acted in reflection. And in between those two decisions, it rediscovered something fragile but essential. Governance is not the same as reaction. In the end, no monument was built to commemorate that vote. No statue of Diodotus stands. But the silence that followed was not one of defeat. It was the silence of a city that had, at the last possible moment, remembered how to listen. The second ship arrived in the harbor of Mytilene, like a breath caught just before collapse. The executioners had already assembled. The sentence was hours from enactment. But then the sails appeared. A message was delivered. The hand holding the blade was lowered. No blood was shed. But make no mistake, a death had occurred. It was the death of certainty, the death of the illusion that power must always move forward without hesitation, that decisions once made must be carried out to preserve authority. The second ship did not simply bring reprieve, it brought dissonance. Athens had nearly committed an atrocity, not in ignorance but in confidence. And what saved them was not remorse but delay. A moment of pause, a vote barely won, a whisper of doubt that overcame a chorus of rage. And so the city of Mytilene remained, its walls intact, its people spared. But the silence afterward was not relief, it was reckoning. Because everyone knew, if the wind had shifted, if the rowers had slowed, if Diodotus had spoken less clearly, they would have crossed a line that no empire can uncross. What arrived in Mytilene that day was more than a message. It was a mirror, and in that mirror, Athens saw the shadow of what it could become, and for a fleeting moment chose otherwise. The Mytilenean debate was not a triumph of justice. It was a close call, a crack in the armor, a reminder that democracies are not immune to rage. They are often its amplifiers. Athens nearly chose to erase a city, not because it had to, but because it could, and because, in moments of fear, the illusion of control feels safer than the uncertainty of restraint. Justice was almost lost, not to tyranny, but to timing. Diodotus did not convince Athens to be merciful. He convinced it to be rational. That may sound colder, but it was the only argument that survived the storm of anger. He reached their minds because their hearts were closed. The lesson is bitter. In moments of crisis, the voice of principle often fails, but the voice of caution, if well spoken, might still hold the line. The second vote was not heroic. It was scared, wary, barely willing to reconsider. And that is what makes it real. Justice did not descend from heaven, it emerged from hesitation, and that is perhaps the most haunting truth of all. Sometimes justice does not win. It simply arrives before the alternative can act, and that is enough to save a city. Once. The Mytilenean debate is not ancient history, it is a modern diagnosis. We still stand in assemblies, on social media, in legislatures, in group chats. We still vote in haste, still speak in anger, still punish to prove resolve rather than to restore order. We still confuse strength with immediacy. The same forces that nearly silenced Mytilene exist in every society. Outrage amplified by fear. Leaders rewarded for decisiveness over deliberation. A public more anxious for revenge than for repair. Our ships today move faster. Our consequences arrive quicker. But the question remains, will we pause long enough to think? Diodotus lives in every cautious voice that says, wait. Cleon lives in every soundbite that says, they deserve it. And the second ship sails each time a policy is reevaluated, a punishment suspended, a hand restrained. Justice today still depends on timing, not because we lack principles, but because we too often ignore them when they're most needed. And if we forget that, we don't need to read Thucydides. We'll just live him again. There was nothing heroic about that second ship. It was not faster than the first, not nobler. It carried no grand speech, no symbol of justice carved in marble. It carried only hesitation. And yet it was the most human vessel Athens ever launched. Because in that ship was a question. Can a society stop itself? Not from collapse. From instinct, from speed, from the very things it's been taught to admire. The ship almost didn't make it. And if it hadn't, we might not remember Mytilene as a narrow escape. We might remember it as another massacre, folded into the routine of empire. But it did arrive. And so we remember. Not because the moment was glorious, but because it was barely saved, because it reminds us that restraint is not the absence of power. It is the highest form of it. The second ship is no longer sailing, but the choice it represents is always on the shore, waiting. Because every generation has its moment to decide. Will we let the first ship reach the city? Or will we, just in time, remember to send another?